Susan Call, and on behalf of our owners and our entire staff, I'd like to welcome you on this evening, this Veterans Day, to hear Elizabeth Samet discuss her new book, No Man's Land, Preparing for War and Peace in Post-9/11 America. Samet is a professor of English at West Point and the author of two previous books, including Soldier's Heart, which won the Los Angeles Times Book Prize for Current Interest. The book is a unique blend of both literary criticism and memoir, and an exploration of what it means for the United States and its soldiery to be adrift between war and peace. It's just out and getting strong reviews, including in the Washington Post, where it was called Required Reading for Serving Officers. The reviewer went on to say, "Fortunate indeed are the cadets who find themselves in her classroom. She's clearly an extraordinary and inspiring teacher who keeps herself intimately involved with the inner lives of her cadets, both during and after their tenures at the military academy." Elizabeth asked me to tell you that the opinions expressed in this work are her own and do not necessarily reflect those of the U.S. Military Academy, the Department of Defense, or the Department of the Army. Please help me welcome Elizabeth Samet.
Thank you very much. It's really nice to see some familiar faces in the crowd. And those unfamiliar faces, I hope to meet you afterwards, and I appreciate your coming out and supporting my work. And thank you very much, Susan, and everyone at Politics and Prose for the invitation to join you today. As I reflected on what I would say today and reflected on my thoughts in starting to write this book, I think that the best answer I gave myself was that I started to write it when the story I'd been telling myself since the beginning of our wars in Afghanistan and Iraq stopped making much sense for me. It's a story I had told in an earlier book, and it was a story very much imagining the arc from peace to war. But things felt a lot murkier than that as time went on, and I felt it was time to reevaluate what I had written then. This is a book, No Man's Land, that's written in memory of two men who died in these wars, Dan Whitten and Chris Gakey. Yet I think it also tells the story of the living. It tries to. Much of it was conceived during a period when, in addition to conducting a correspondence with many of my former students, and I think that's probably one of the most wonderful things about teaching at West Point is that ongoing relationship with one's students. In addition to that, I was directing West Point's freshman literature course, which is taken by more than 1,000 plebes every spring. And I think many of my best spent hours have been in the company of those plebes who are finding their way in a new and seldom comfortable world, learning a new language, figuring out what it means to be a cadet. I like the person I am most, I think, with those young men and women, and I see in them a vitality that battles against the destruction and death that have, for many of us, marked the century's beginning. They have an energy that helps me to navigate the perilous no man's land of readying them for whatever future awaits. No man's land, of course, dates back the concept to the 14th century as a kind of wasteland. But it's World War I, with its shattered landscape of the Western Front, of course, that gives us our image today, through literature, photography, and cinema, an image very much with us. And I think it's an apt phrase, even though it's now an old term, to describe my own predicament, and I think also that of many soldiers that I'm fortunate to know. So I thought I'd just read a little section about the term itself and about how I arrived at my current feelings. In what now seems early days, I wove my own comforting narrative of the new century. I taught myself to interpret its story as a neat arc from peace to war, and it proved a most practical plot, at least for a time. I could lose myself in it, as I might in any good yarn. Its sensational beginning and harrowing middle helped me for a time to ignore the fact that there was no satisfactory end in view. The plot reaffirmed my commitment to West Point, where I was charged with educating future Army officers, by clarifying the enterprise in which it was ostensibly engaged. I was preparing the cadets in my classes to go to war. It was as simple as that. My students found a similar appeal in this narrative, particularly in its urgency. They thrilled to the idea that they were coming of age in a moment of crisis. Swept away by the momentum of their tale, cadets could keep at bay many of the doubts that typically dog college students even as they were forced to address other questions concerning their courage, integrity, and capacity to endure, questions that usually vex us later in life. They would graduate from West Point, deploy to Iraq or Afghanistan, and lead a platoon into war. Stories grow ingrained by force of habit. We all rehearsed this war story until we became expert at telling it to ourselves and to others. War had become the normal state of things at West Point before I realized that its rhythms were not necessarily conforming to expectation, and that the blueprint according to which we had been mapping our lives was not altogether sound. We tell ourselves stories in order to live, or at least we do so for a while. That's what Joan Didion proposes at the beginning of the White Album, an essay that chronicles her recognition of the imperfect fictions we weave with such desperation. I, too, had arrived at a moment when the story I'd been weaving so assiduously unraveled, leaving little but doubt as the campaigns in Iraq and Afghanistan rolled on. When I discovered that the stories I was telling myself no longer served, I started slowly to revise. I even began to congratulate myself on my prescience. Let my colleagues continue to think exclusively about the arduous voyage out, about the battlefield as the ultimate destination. I would focus on the labor of coming home. Let generals try to impress on me a sense of my responsibility by showing me dramatic photographs of lieutenants perched on Afghan hilltops, youthful monarchs of all they surveyed. Let them tell me this was the end state or the outcome. I was always to keep in mind as I went about the business of teaching tomorrow's officers. But no amount of bureaucratese could conceal the deep romance of this image, this heroic drama of muddy boots, and I knew it was the wrong romance. Others could go on imagining an Iliad if they liked, imagining that the end of the war, the victory, was the end of the story. I knew better, I thought. We were all of us, the ones who went to war and the ones who waited at home, inhabiting a kind of odyssey, in which the hardest struggle comes after the battle has been won, the city sacked, the spoils taken, the dead buried, and the wounded there to remind us of a violent interlude we would rather forget. Warlike Achilles on a hilltop wasn't the hero of the story I began to tell. My heroes became, in addition to reluctant Odysseus, whose journey home to Ithaca proves more arduous than his war, Balzac's Colonel Chabert, resurrected from a mass grave on a battlefield to arrive home in Paris to everyone's surprise and inconvenience, and the ambivalent Captain Ivanov of Andrei Platonov's exquisite 1946 short story The Return, who, after 4 years away at war, finds himself a shy intruder within his own family. The new plot galvanized my teaching. I found a special contentment in focusing on the institution's newest novitiates, the plebes, over 1,000 strong each year, whose introductory core course in literature I directed. This second draft of my story was better, richer, and more complicated. It even had what looked like an end, coming home. This was something, yet it was not quite enough, for it didn't account for the fact that none of the soldiers I knew stayed home for very long. Most of them felt a restlessness and an alienation they attempted to cure by means of a cross-country bike ride, a motorcycle trip, a long vacation to South America, the ending of one romantic relationship, or the beginning of another. Some kept moving by leaving the army and embarking on a new career or going back to school. Those who stayed in the service soon discovered that instead of simply going to war and coming home, they had become war commuters, shuttling back and forth on serial deployments. On his third Afghanistan tour in 2012, a helicopter pilot named Adam wrote to tell me, "This war has become more normal to me than life at home." Soon after reaching the States, he mused, "Well, I've been home for just over a week now. It's strange. I still don't feel quite as though I've arrived, if that makes any sense." Even on the flight home, I had the odd sensation that I was commuting, just making another transatlantic hop. To the soldier who feels that he has become, like Adam, a war commuter, home is perhaps the strangest place there is. And it isn't quite the same strangeness we might associate with prolonged absence. The typical war commuter, tethered, like more conventional commuters, by email, cell phone, social media, and Skype, even at the farthest geographical removes, has effectively punched a clock on a 12-month, sometimes a 15-month shift, and then gone home to get ready for the next cycle. I don't mean at all to diminish the hazards of the job, merely to suggest the routinization of even the most extraordinary experiences. Commuting is a plot without romance, a tale without an end, or at least without a recognizably heroic end. Even in the ideal case, the movies, years of commuting conclude inadequately, with a farewell dinner, perhaps the presentation of a gold watch. The story of today's war commuter, if it doesn't end abruptly and violently, refuses to end at all. Instead, it is a story with a series of false endings, each homecoming but a prelude to the next deployment, until at last the job ends. The terms most often used to describe the current epic, long war, era of persistent conflict, war without end, do not adequately suggest the effects of this ambiguous, indeterminate passage on a new generation of war commuters, combat veterans who have become the objects of a public's simultaneously overheated and fleeting regard, or on the public itself. Adrift between war and peace, we have been living in an era for which we still have no satisfactory name, and in an archaic term inherited from the war that was supposed to end them all, I have found what seems to me the most appropriate description for the space we have entered. So once I figured out that I was no longer simply preparing students to go to war, but for coming home and going back again and all sorts of other things in between, I realized that I had to focus on a certain set of attributes that I hoped my discipline, literature, would contribute to their success. They get plenty of military training, plenty of training in the field at West Point. They also get plenty of training in the classroom. But literature, I think, offers a particular way for them to contemplate their world and their future. And so I began to think of the ways in which I might produce the kind of thinking, the kind of flexibility and resilience that the most successful officers I know, the most successful officers I've had the privilege to work with, seem to manage. I also realized what a daunting task this was as I looked out on those 1,000 plebes each spring. And it was even more daunting when I looked out on their parents, who come every spring to visit something called Plebe Parent Weekend. And for several years, I was lucky enough to give a talk to all those parents. And the first time I gave the talk, it came on the heels of a discovery that I had made. And you're going to wonder where I've been hiding when I made this discovery. I was having a conversation after work with a friend who told me, because I was boasting about something or other, that I was a mere muggle. And it sounded like a slur at the time. I couldn't be sure what I demanded as a muggle. And all those who have devotedly followed the adventures of J.K. Rowling's Harry Potter, and I know there are some in the audience because they have been fans as long as I have known them, will wonder, as I said, how I hadn't figured this out. Here I had been thoroughly persuaded of my own formidable, albeit eccentric and esoteric brand of English professor magic, only to discover that I had no witchcraft at all. At one efficient stroke, the last vestige of my long-preserved childhood fantasies, soothsaying, sorcery, and superpowers had been destroyed. Sometimes I guess it's good to be disabused of one's delusions. It's what one does with such revelations that matters. And so, as I said, I had just discovered this when the parents showed up, and there I was, ready to give them a talk. And so I decided that I should air this public confession of my circumscribed powers to those very people, in fact, for whom I most wanted to be superhuman, all those mothers and fathers. And I was addressing them in Eisenhower Hall, and it's called Ike at West Point, which happens to be the second largest theater in the United States east of the Mississippi. Only Radio City exceeds its capacity. That's a big stage, my colleague Karen told me, when she learned I'd be speaking there. Really big. You can't fill that stage all by yourself. You'll need something, she said, some pictures at least, knowing my hatred of PowerPoint. Maybe, she said, you could get the Rockettes. So performing my one-woman show in this vast expanse was at once easy and impossible. The speech was a cinch because the plebes are, and have been for a long time now, my favorite people. I love to talk about them, really, to anyone who'll listen to me. Just on the verge of indoctrination, they managed to combine a passion for their chosen vocation with a healthy perspective on the vagaries of the system. But it was difficult all the same because I was talking about them to their parents, who had assumed, to my admittedly overactive imagination, the appearance of a formidable sleuth of mother and father bears. On my giant stage, peering out into the dim auditorium and beholding the eyes of all those vigilant bears staring back at me from the dark, I began to articulate my new philosophy, for them and for myself. It had to do with ambition and imagination and the ways in which these attributes could be cultivated, even in the newest members of an organization who were still trying to learn its languages, rhythms, and customs. Fostering even in its most junior members whatever it takes to endure beyond the end of the battle, helping them to cultivate the art of long-term survival, is one of the chief responsibilities that a professional army owes to those who serve in it. Far-thinking soldiers have always honed this capacity, even in the most exigent circumstances. And I decided that what I was preparing them for really was to be unprepared, for the inevitability of their own unpreparedness. And when I looked for examples of people who had this flexibility of mind, I happened to find one in a completely unknown graduate. And I found him in the library records, and I would take my plebes there to see the various Edgar Allan Poe and other artifacts we have there from Ulysses S. Grant and other graduates. And I like to show them something called the cadet borrowing records. Throughout much of the 19th century, West Point cadets were permitted to check books out of the library only once a week. On Saturday afternoon, the regulations from 1857 state, any book that a cadet may have been reading during the week may be taken to his quarters on the approval of the librarian and shall be returned on the succeeding Monday. If not then returned, he shall be reported by the librarian. Decades of weekly borrowing activity are recorded in these fabulous handwritten ledgers, and they're now preserved in the archives. I've spent a fair bit of time looking through them with cadets and on my own, following the charge record of a given title or tracking the reading habits of an individual cadet. There are, as I said, storied names in the ledgers, Lee, Sherman, and Grant, who refers in his memoirs to the fine library connected with the academy. But usually I end up trailing an unknown. And a few years ago, hunting for a wartime reader who might have something to say to my own classes of wartime readers, I discovered someone named John T. Pittman, Jr., who graduated in 1867. Pittman was an unpredictable borrower, his name absent from the records for weeks at a time before it reappeared next to a general history of mathematics, a volume of Goethe's works in German, some Dickens novels, David Copperfield, Dombey and Son, Barnaby Rudge. The first book he took back to his quarters, and the book I was reading with the cadets, and that's why I stopped on Pittman's name, was Great Expectations. And he checked it out just a few weeks after he arrived at West Point in 1863. I don't know why he chose it. Perhaps beginning a new phase of his life, he found something of moment in the story of a young man reckoning with the attendant confusions of Great Expectations. Perhaps John Pittman had his first introduction to Great Expectations in a copy of Harper's Weekly in an Army camp. He served in the Union Army before coming to West Point. In July 1861, only 3 days after enlisting as a private in the 1st Rhode Island Volunteer Infantry, he joined the rest of the innocents at the chaotic Battle of Bull Run, the first major engagement of the Civil War. Nearly all of us, William Tecumseh Sherman, in command of a brigade there, wrote of his inexperienced troops, for the first time then heard the sound of cannon and muskets in anger, and saw the bloody scenes common to all battles, with which we were soon to be familiar. 2 years later, having been promoted to second lieutenant, the rank at which West Point graduates are commissioned, Pittman became the oldest member of the Academy's newest class. President Lincoln personally appointed him to fill a slot left vacant because it had been assigned to one of the southern states. I introduced Pittman to the plebes at the beginning of the semester, and he became so much a part of us that whenever I neglected to mention him, one of them, Michael, would demand, "Hey, ma'am, what's up with Mr. Pittman?" Pittman's ghostly presence in class led us down a path of inquiry we might not otherwise have followed. How would future generations know who these plebes were, how their minds worked, what moved them, where their passions led? When I put all these questions to them, they agreed that the clues about their lives and interests probably won't be found in library records. Indeed, they marveled that checking out a book was such a rare treat for their predecessors. As privileges go, this one didn't seem especially decadent. But aren't books a good thing, Eli asked, an educational thing? Today's plebes are more likely to download recreational books or to buy them online than to check them out of the library, and they have so many more sources of diversion than Pittman had. If it survives at all, the record of the plebes' curiosities, of the subjects that excite them, will probably be virtual. Michael's online purchases, Tripp's Netflix queue, Eli's iTunes library, RJ's Mustang forum posts. Mary and Alex, 2 other plebes in my class, predicted that with some disappointment, that maybe their traces would consist largely of emoticon-filled Facebook status updates. Emails, too, might reveal something about the life of their minds. I get that type of email all the time. At around the time I was getting to know John Pittman and the plebes, I received such a message from Liz, who happens to be sitting in the audience tonight. At the time, she was a lieutenant running a battalion aid station in Afghanistan. She wrote about the reading habits of her soldiers, to whom she is clearly devoted and whose abilities she greatly admires. I'm amazed at the amount of books some of my soldiers plow through, she wrote. Some read biographies, others historical fiction, others lighthearted beach reads. It is fun to see their personalities matched alongside their reading choices. Liz has long been interested in the nexus of war and writing. At West Point, she wrote a prize-winning thesis on American soldier poets of World War II, whose voices have been neglected in favor of their novel-writing contemporaries. Liz argued that the poetic traces of these soldiers, visceral, frank, irreverent, can enrich our understanding of the greatest generation. In Afghanistan, Liz, a soldier poet herself, read and wrote constantly. I have been keeping a record of the books I have been reading over here, she reported in a letter that arrived at the beginning of the semester, and have been considering writing an article about how reading affects our wartime experience. It may not go anywhere but my journal, she concluded, but it's a concept that keeps grabbing my attention. The last book Pittman checked out, the final trace that I could find of him in the ledgers, was the first volume of Thackeray's Virginians, a historical novel that I don't think people read anymore. It opens with the narrator expressing the desire to recreate bygone times and people by poring over the documents they've left behind. They are hints rather than descriptions, Thackeray writes, indications and outlines chiefly. Yet from such traces one might still try to imagine the situation of the writer, where he was and by what persons surrounded. I don't know if Pittman ever finished Thackeray's novel, nor do I know what books he read after graduation, but I like to imagine that he remained an eclectic reader throughout his career in the Ordnance Corps, which was long and successful. He retired in 1906 as a brigadier general. But he's largely uncelebrated outside of friends, family, and weapons experts. Early in his career, Pittman returned to West Point as assistant professor of chemistry, mineralogy, and geology, and assistant instructor of ordnance and gunnery. Photography was one of his hobbies, and his photographs offer a pictorial history of the period during which he served on the faculty. Pittman eventually became what was called a powder specialist, who, as his nomination to the Ordnance Corps Hall of Fame, you may not know there is such a thing, but there is, explains, made invaluable contributions to the development of small arms, explosives, and propellants. Among these contributions were a series of volumes on weaponry, the Pittman Notes, and the production of a variety of smokeless powder, ammunition that replaced the black powder that for centuries fouled weapons and obscured battlefields with clouds of smoke. The propellant grain he developed is still in use today. Pittman spent a great deal of time experimenting with metals for bullet jackets, pressure gauges. There is also a sense in which his life serves as a kind of practical primer for cadets today. He's the model of a soldier, not a legend or larger-than-life hero. How many of us really become those? But a thoughtful, curious, devoted professional who throughout a life of action found it essential to exercise a life of the mind, and by doing so made invaluable contributions to the Army. In exploring John Pittman's inner life, I thought, perhaps, the plebes would discover a path of their own. But the traces I followed have nothing to do with munitions. They are entirely literary. I found John Pittman and introduced him to the plebes because he happened to enjoy a good novel. Battle-tested in his youth at Bull Run in 1861, Pittman seemed able to imagine something beyond survival. He found new challenges to keep him in the service through the beginning of the 20th century. He was defiantly a specialist with a superior technical competence, but his spirit of experimentation and his broad range of interests and avocations suggest that he was precisely the kind of model that former Secretary of Defense Gates recommended in his speech to cadets a few years ago, in which he expressed the fear that the Army would lose those junior officers who have had such intense tactical experience over the last decade, precisely because it would fail to foster their entrepreneurial spirit and to promote the kind of full-spectrum thinking that the force would require. the consequences, Gates confessed, of failing to encourage and to challenge battle-tested officers, but instead funneling them into predictable, well-trod career paths and warehousing them in rigid assignments and promotion patterns terrify me, he said. So Pittman's story and my students' acquaintance with it, with his eclectic, lifelong passions and ambitions, became essential to our undertaking and to the ways in which I conceived this course as something that would help them prepare for their own unpreparedness. Thanks very much.
As a high school English teacher who retired a couple of years ago, I was very curious about what you were going to say tonight, and I would love to hear some of the titles that you include in this freshman course. This past year, I just read Grant's memoirs and loved them, and I could see that being helpful. But the book that I liked even more was All Quiet on the Western Front, and I thought to ask men, young men about to go off to war, to read that book, it would take an extraordinary teacher to keep their spirits up. And I was curious as to how you would deal with that.
Well, the young men and women in my classroom, actually, I find many of them have read that book, I think in high school, maybe on their own or in the summer. And I think it's actually the responsibility of anyone who teaches future officers to present them with all sorts of different perspectives on war. And so we discuss, frankly, books like that, the poetry of Wilfred Owen and other World War I poets, and really the full range of war literature and film as well. Some of the books I teach really range. Often I find that teaching war literature per se isn't the most effective way to talk about the issues of war. And so I often find that those subjects of loyalty and courage and cowardice and all these other issues that weigh on their minds are often best approached obliquely through novels that perhaps have nothing to do with war or poetry and other genres.
Professor, I've only just picked up your book, so forgive me if you
Sure.
address it in here. Was Paul Fussel's The Great War in Modern Memory, was that an influence upon your concept of no man's land, or your reworking of the concept of no man's land? And this is not facetious, but I've seen a couple of the reviews. Is there really something wrong with saying thank you for your service?
That is a good question for Veterans Day, I think, absolutely. In answer to the first part of your question, Fussel's work as a literary critic is, of course, hugely influential. I think in anyone who studies World War I literature particularly, and while that's not my particular area of focus, I think it's less his study of that particular war than his approach to looking at the culture that emerged from a particular war and how the landscape was changed in so many different ways, and how that war, and actually one could make this case for Vietnam, for the United States, but certainly for that war in England, changing the way people thought and spoke about it. So that was certainly influential. On the thank you for your service question, and I have gotten I've written pieces on this before, and I will stick to my guns on this one. I think, unfortunately, even when it is well-meaning, it is a sort of formulaic substitute for what I would regard as a more meaningful engagement. It is wonderful to celebrate veterans on Veterans Day, but what happens during the rest of the year? And I just think that it forecloses meaningful conversation rather than opening the door.
Historically, I think of West Point as an engineering school. When did the change of bringing in the liberal arts and sociology take place, and who drove it such that it was acceptable to the generals?
Well, certainly throughout at its founding and then throughout the 19th century when the Army Corps of Engineers was building railroads across the country and engaged in all sorts of other infrastructure projects, it was absolutely a school for engineers. But in the 20th century, things began to change when MacArthur was the superintendent, and then in subsequent iterations. It has become a place where a cadet can get a full liberal arts education. There are still an engineering component, and that's very important, but the understanding that cadets need exposure to a wide variety of disciplines and approaches has now become a standard. The time, well, MacArthur was the superintendent in the 20s. Well, he certainly began at the time to begin with this initiative, and then throughout the century those things have changed. Only, I would say, actually I'm going to consult with someone who may know exactly, but probably in the late 60s and 70s electives started coming into the program, and then even later a full-fledged majors program.
Majors were introduced in the mid-1970s.
70s.
But as you said, literature, history, philosophy have been taught this for
Since the 20s, yeah. So for example, the English department and history departments and those and social sciences departments in the 20s became independent entities.
What has made Afghanistan and Iraq so unique has been the rogue killer and the suicide killer and the revenge killer. What challenges have you faced from the commandant since the plebe and the cadet is really taught to be a soldier, provide defense to the nation, to minimize casualty and catastrophe? Wesley Clark was here several weeks ago, well, within the past 2 weeks. He reminded me of a cross between Alexander Haig and Dr. Strangelove. His solution was to bring order by bombing everything and then dig for more oil and be self-sufficient. But more importantly, what challenges have you had from the Commandant's office in developing your course for plebes?
Sir, I'm not sure I entirely understand the question. If the challenge is...
Well, a proper English course involves teaching people how to write and be literate, as well as include humanism and what has happened over the course of time through the written word of how to have a better life or what happens when things go wrong. The soldier is taught to follow orders.
The soldier is taught to follow lawful orders, and the soldier does not abdicate entirely his or her own moral compass. I would say that I don't receive challenges from my military colleagues, but that it is a cooperative effort, and that I think there is a space, even in a hierarchical organization, for independent thinking and ethical reasoning, and those are valued by all components of the academy.
That's true, but unless one understands proper orders and does so meaningfully, it creates havoc and causes death.
Thank you for your talk. Forgive me if this is something you cover in your book, but I haven't
Sure.
haven't read it yet. When I think of the benefits of literature, I think of empathy and getting to know people that you never would meet in your life at all. Could you tell us how you use literature, you said, to prepare for unpreparedness? Maybe you could be a little more specific. What books, what do you get out of the books, or flexibility and resilience, those things. What books and how do you do that?
Sure. Well, as to the empathy question first, I think by confronting students, any reader, with stories that are unfamiliar, stories you have not lived yourself, there is an opening and an awareness of other people's lives, of other cultures as well. We teach literature from a variety of cultures. There's a colleague who was Rick, who's here, who's the former head of our foreign language department, all sorts of partnerships looking at literature in translation, literature in original languages, and fostering cross-cultural engagement. in terms of work that helps people prepare for the unexpected, I could give innumerable examples, and the same answer won't be true, of course, for every student. But one text that I frequently return to, because I think it helps students to understand that sometimes people have a script for them, and it isn't always the script they anticipate, is Shakespeare's Hamlet, in that I read that as the story of someone whose life is in fact scripted for him by his father and by others, and who wrestles with that script and would actually like to live a rather different life, and so navigates all sorts of cultural and familial pressures, and has to work his own way through that. And the plebes in particular, I think, respond to that as they're moving from one culture to another.
I had a comment and a question.
Sure.
A comment to thank you for writing so beautifully about this aspect of the military academy, so thank you. The question I have is how have the plebes changed from when you first went to West Point, and the wars were many years ago, to today, and what observations would you have about the changes you've seen?
I think once the war began, my colleagues and I, who had been teaching there during peacetime, when we'd talk about that or when we were asked about it, usually came up with the answer that there was a sense of urgency. And I think that that was true. I don't know that different kinds of students came. They felt in some ways very much the same, but we felt that there was a specific, particular context for our work, and that context didn't always crowd into the classroom, but it was always there, and so we would sometimes feel it in important ways. I think over the last several years, as they've had to think about what I talked before about scripts, they had a script, and I mentioned that in the passage that I read, that they were certain what they would be doing when they were lieutenants, when they were commissioned. And now they're not so sure about that. No one's really sure what it's going to look like. And so helping them navigate, that's a change. That uncertainty has, I think, of recently been the most important change and the most important thing to address in various ways in the classroom, and to help them imagine meaningful service, no matter what the future looks like.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Hi. You write about a lot of your plebes, a lot of your students in both of your books. You write about one of my favorite plebes, Kevin. And I wonder how you have so much time to spend with them, because it's so valuable to them. So I want to appreciate you for that. Kevin is a huge fan, as you know. And he became an English major because of your influence, actually. He didn't go to West Point. Somebody brought up, what is it about, when did it become kind of acceptable, or when did it become, acceptable that you could study literature up there and not be an engineer in particular. I think he went up there with an engineering bent and realized that if he was going to do this, he really needed to find a way to express himself. And it came through the literature studies, and he ended up being an English major. What I'm wondering about is, you corresponded with him during his deployments, and you correspond with Grant and Renee and some of the others there, many others. How is it for you to watch everything they go through and correspond with them on matters that are so difficult, like the fact that they imagined that they would see the face of their enemy, but they don't, because it could be an IED. You never see the face of your enemy in this kind of a war. Or getting there and finding that, my son told me that sometimes he felt more safe out on a mission than he did in the FOB, and the bureaucracy that can go on while you're over there, and things like coming home and feeling so different. How is it that you are able to keep up with everybody, and what is that like for you? How does that enrich your life as an instructor to be so deeply a part of your students' lives?
Well, I have time to do it because it's one of the most important things I do, and I can't separate that correspondence from the work that I do in the classroom. And there are several of those correspondents out here today, in fact. And the wonderful thing, one of the most wonderful things about it, is that more than they know, they shape curriculum at West Point, at least from my small little piece of that curriculum. I'm always asking, I'm always marveling at the way that the literature I read with my students at West Point has completely changed for them when they find themselves in new surroundings. It means something else to them. I have had that experience as well. I mentioned this idea of being a wartime reader. So many of the books I read during peacetime are just different now. And they're different now because of the way I read them, but they're also different because of the way that I see them through my former students' eyes. And so I make it a point to do that. I think a lot of people, a lot of my colleagues who teach at civilian schools hear from most of their students when they want letters of recommendation. And that's natural, and I hear from people when they want letters too. But this whole different sort of dimension, really, to working there and teaching there has been, one of the most important parts. So, thanks.
I'd like to thank you for your presentation and return to the thank you for your service syndrome. Personally, I share your view, but I think I should be gracious enough to acknowledge that there could be, it's dangerous to generalize too much about the motivation of people who do voice those kind of appreciations. And I would like to know, do you have suggestions on better ways that they could do the same thing?
Yeah, I mean, I try not to generalize about the motivations. I think that most people who offer that are motivated by a kind of generosity of spirit rather than anything else. There are all sorts of ways, I think, in everyday life. Sometimes I've had, when I speak at college campuses, people ask, well, what can I do? What can I say? Are there veterans in your classrooms? Yes. Well, talk to them the way you'd talk to anyone else, right? There's this idea that we distance veterans and make them seem somehow other, even though they've had different experiences from many of us. So it's an ongoing process, and I think my concern with that phrase is that when it ends there, that's just not enough. So there are all sorts of ways. There are other ways. There are many people who volunteer at various organizations who work in many ways to support the veteran community, and I think that's vital.
Hi, Elizabeth. First, I'd like to say that I really appreciate your focus on teaching in here, and that I already miss teaching Russian at West Point. Secondly, I'm going to chew on your comments about teaching literature and resilience. I think that's a very important point. And finally, you mentioned that there is some impact of non-English literatures on your understanding of No Man's Land. Could you talk about that, particularly about War and Peace, if there are any that inform that?
Right. Well, War and Peace, that book is a huge influence, and on my thinking about war, on my thinking about all of the complexities and the interwoven nature of war and peace. In terms of the other literature from other cultures that's had an impact. This year I'm teaching a course on world literature, so world literature and translation to some juniors and seniors. And we're following the path of Alexander the Great, and we're doing it through a variety of cultures. So we move from ancient Greece to the Persian epic, the Shahnameh, where Alexander appears as Sikander. And we use that text and its very different take on Alexander as a way to move through different parts of the world and different understandings of heroism and of all sorts of aspects relating to war and to governing and justice and all sorts of other things. So I would say one other strong influence is Chinese poetry, which doesn't treat the subject of war. Instead, omits warfare itself as not a fit subject for heroic celebration. And so I'm reading that actually right now with my students. And we are searching for things that we normally expect in Western poems about war, and we don't find them. And so we have to examine what's there instead and why that's the case. So.
We'll take these two last questions.
Okay. I'd have reference to a couple of other creative works that illustrate an uncertainty on my part. After Vietnam, Michael Hare's book Dispatches was put to a rock war musical by Elizabeth Swados. And I remember hearing one of the songs, "Can't Make It Back in the World," which was an expression that was manifested by a lot of young men who came back and somehow had their minds and thoughts twisted and found it difficult to readjust. And fast forward to the great movie Hurt Locker, about a demolition expert who came home, played by Jeremy Renner, and I remember a scene in the movie where he was with his child, his baby, in the kitchen, and he had a choice. In the next scene, he'd made his choice, and he was back in Iraq, disarming bombs. It's the "can't make it back in the world" theme in the modern era. With the discipline that young men and women get at West Point, they probably don't have this "can't make it back in the world" idea. But how does that force manifest itself in trained officers when they're back here? The war is over, basically. What do they struggle with? How does that manifest itself in young officers growing into senior officers? Is there some way that you can articulate how that happens? It's very different, it seems to me, for people that have training.
Right. I think people deal with it in different ways. One of the phrases that I hear from some of the most thoughtful young officers I know is that things are different. And that doesn't mean they're better or worse, but they're different. And that learning to accept that and learning to understand that and proceed from that start point is the way that they come back to the world.
Thank you, first of all, for your wonderfully prepared presentation this evening. It was really beautifully presented. Could you tell us a little bit about how you chose to teach at a military academy rather than a civilian university?
Sure. There are two answers to that. My father and Ulysses S. Grant. So, my father served in World War II, and he is older than the fathers of many of my contemporaries. And I think I grew up with a very different understanding of the military, the Army in particular. His Army was very different than this Army. Nevertheless, I grew up listening to his stories. And he went to school after the war on the GI Bill. This marriage of education and military service in my mind was there from the start. I didn't think about that, though, for many years. Then in graduate school, when I was working on my dissertation, I ended up finding, and I can't even do the archaeology anymore, but I ended up finding military memoirs, among them Ulysses S. Grant's memoir, which has a wonderful passage early on about how much he hated and loved West Point. And he loved the books he was reading. I quoted that little passage about the library. He didn't like the fact that people had the power of bulldozing him, as he called it. And he looked forward to the time when he could come back to the academy and people no longer had that authority over him. But that passage alone wasn't really what intrigued me. It was his very nuanced understanding of war. And he fought in two wars. The first he didn't believe in, the Mexican War. The second he did. He believed in the Civil War as a war of principle. And his really thoughtful, and I think to our ears very modern sensibilities about war as a business that was unromantic, that he had committed to, and that caused him great pain and the loss of friends, and his very careful and methodical dissection of that experience was something that really drew me. And it was around that time that I learned of the job at West Point. And so really it was Grant and my dad. So. Well, thank you very much. Thanks.